Well, clearly we see a very destabilized situation in eastern Ukraine. Began about 2 months ago with the illegal annexation by Russia of the Crimea Peninsula. Obviously, Crimea is part of the territory of Ukraine, but today it continues along the eastern provinces of Ukraine. Those are the provinces that border Russia itself, where you see inside Ukraine destabilizing actions like proxy soldiers, armed thugs taking over government buildings in about 20 towns and cities in that sort of eastern provincial area. You see roadblocks assembled. You see most alarmingly, and just recently, one of the OSCE observer teams being detained by these sorts of elements. And we believe that there's incontrovertible evidence that these destabilizing forces in eastern Ukraine are in fact sponsored by and working alongside Russian authorities. Meanwhile, just across the border in Russia itself, you see something like 40,000 Russian conventional forces assembled as clearly an act of intimidation. So Russia's using political, sort of unconventional military efforts inside Ukraine. And then you see a very large conventional backup, military backup in Russia itself. And when you combine these measures, the annexation of Crimea, along with these destabilizing features in Ukraine today, you have a very dangerous situation, which could easily get out of control. So that's essentially what's happening today. Now, what is NATO doing in response? I'd first put NATO's response in the context of the broader international effort. For NATO, this is not fundamentally a military threat. However, there are NATO borderline states, eastern borderline states, who have expressed concern about NATO's ability to respond if this were to develop into a NATO threat. And therefore, NATO's taken a set of measures that we call reassurance measures, which are designed to reassure those eastern allied states that if their territory were violated, as we see Ukraine's territory today, then NATO would be prepared to fulfill its commitment to defend them. And so you see things like the very prominent deployment of U.S. ground troops over the last several days into the Baltic states and into Poland, but you also see reinforcement of NATO aircraft to patrol the skies over these states, and you see naval activity both in the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea. So air, sea, ground, north, center, south in the eastern states, that's been NATO's role. Those military measures, those reassurance measures, though, should fall into the broader context of what the international community is doing. And on the political side, you see broad condemnation of Russia's activities at the United Nations, at the EU, at OSCE. You see OSCE and the EU sending monitors in to try to get ground truth in terms of what's happening in this very unstable setting in Ukraine. And on the financial side, on the economic side, you see the US and the EU making significant financial contributions to try to stabilize the economy of Ukraine. And very prominently, you see the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, opening up a $17 billion program to try to get Ukraine back on its feet economically. So this is a multi-dimensional, very international, multilateral approach to try to stabilize the situation. Well, look, NATO's since its inception, 65 years ago. So, by the way, this just coincidentally is the 65th anniversary of the signing of the Washington Treaty, which is the treaty 1949 that set NATO in place. It's had from that original treaty, 65 years ago, an obligation in Article 5 of the treaty that an attack on one will be considered an attack on all. So NATO's not new to this mutual defense business. It's been there from the outset. Now, in the meantime, however, over the last 20 years, or say 25 since the fall of the Berlin Wall, you see that NATO has exported security. It has extended security beyond its own borders. You saw this first in the mid-90s in the Balkans, first in Bosnia, later in Kosovo, and more recently, over the last 10 years, you've seen NATO operate in a big way in its largest and longest ever combat operation in Afghanistan. So NATO has been very busy. Some argue that this is a wake-up call for NATO. I respond that NATO's been awake the whole time, but you haven't been paying attention. And we've been very busy over the last 2 decades. I think what Ukraine reminds us, though, is that NATO has more than one task at its core. It has the task of collective defense, so an attack on one is an attack on all. It also, over the last 20 years, has been very busy in the contingency business, that is, operations beyond NATO's boundaries. We call that crisis management. And then it also has a third core task called cooperative security. And this is where we work with states outside the alliance to try to promote their defense capability. NATO's got to be able to do all 3 of these things at one time. And I don't know of any point in NATO's history where it has been a sort of one-job alliance. I think anybody who works on Afghanistan deliberately for an extended period of time is neither an optimist nor a pessimist, but ought to learn to be a realist. And the realist in me suggests that the future of NATO operations, and in fact this is true nationally of U.S. operations, beyond the end of this year, so beyond December 2014, is in the hands of Afghan political authorities. So far, that political stance has meant that President Karzai has not signed the letter of invitation, if you will. That is the bilateral security agreement, or its counterpart NATO document, authorizing us, inviting us, and authorizing us to operate beyond December. He has left that to his successor. Now, the Afghan political scene is now trying to generate his successor. The first round of elections took place in early April. They were very well administered. However, they didn't render a clear-cut result. So there will be a runoff. And the timing of that runoff, the inauguration of a new president, his signing of these 2 authority documents will dictate whether or not NATO and the U.S. have an invitation to be there beyond this year. What I can tell you is, as our president has been very clear, and NATO in turn has been very clear, that if invited, we have a preference to be there. Now, this is to be there beyond 2014, not an extension of the combat mission, not an extension of the current operation, but in a new mission. Many fewer troops, much more narrow mission, but in an effort to continue developing the Afghan security forces so that eventually they alone can stand and defend Afghanistan. We don't think they're there yet. They've made tremendous progress. Most recently witnessed the elections that they secured, but we think that that development process can benefit from our continued presence beyond this year if we receive an invitation.